I heard the door before I heard him. Not the click of the lock, the way it slammed, like he'd forgotten his own strength. 3 years of living with Theo Marsh had taught me the sound of every mood he owned, and this one I'd never heard before. I stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in my hand and watched the only man I'd ever loved in silence fall apart in our hallway. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me like I was the only solid thing left in the room. I should have known then that nothing between us would ever be simple again. I should have packed my bags that same night and saved myself the fall that was coming. Instead, I stayed. I always stayed. But what happened next changed my life forever. Theo Marsh did not cry. In 3 years of sharing a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on 9th Street, I had seen him lose a job interview, break 2 fingers falling off a borrowed bike, and sit through his sister's wedding toast with a face carved out of granite. He didn't cry. So when he walked through our door at 11 at night with his tie loosened and his eyes red-rimmed, I set down the dish towel very slowly, like sudden movement might break him. "Elena's gone," he said. That was all. 2 words, and then he walked past me into the living room and sat down on the couch we'd bought second-hand off a nursing student who was moving to Portland. He put his elbows on his knees and stared at the carpet like it owed him an explanation. I didn't ask what happened. I'd learned that much about Theo. He told you things when he was ready, not when you were curious. So I made him tea he wouldn't drink and sat on the opposite end of the couch, close enough that he'd know I wasn't going anywhere, far enough that he could pretend I wasn't watching him come undone. "She said I wasn't really here," he finally said. "Not all the way. She said it's like dating someone who's already promised to someone else, except I don't even know who I'm promised to." He laughed, short and bitter. I told her that's insane. She just looked at me like she felt sorry for me. I kept my eyes on my mug. 3 years of practice had made me good at that, keeping my face still while something inside me reacted anyway. Because I did know something about promises I'd never made out loud. I knew exactly how it felt to belong to someone who didn't know they had you. "You're allowed to be a mess tonight," I told him instead. "Tomorrow you can go back to being insufferably fine about everything." That got the corner of his mouth to move, just barely. Insufferably fine. Is that my brand? It's your entire personality, Marsh. He looked at me then, really looked, the way he hadn't in a long time, like he was trying to remember something he'd misplaced. "Thanks for not asking me what I did wrong," he said quietly. "You didn't do anything wrong. People just end sometimes. Relationships aren't always about blame." He didn't answer that. He just sat with it, and I sat with him, and outside our window the city kept moving like nothing had happened at all, which felt, somehow, like the cruelest part. The weeks after Elena left, Theo became someone I didn't fully recognize. He started coming home earlier. He started cooking, badly, but he tried, standing in our kitchen in his socks, burning garlic and swearing at the pan like it had personally wronged him. He asked me about my day. Not the polite roommate version of asking, where you nod through the answer waiting for your turn to talk. He actually listened, like my life was something worth paying attention to. "You got the freelance job," he said one night, when I told him a design studio in Chicago wanted to fly me out for a final interview. He said it flatly, like I told him the building was on fire. "I got an interview. Nothing's decided. You're going to get it." He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the stove, at the pasta he'd definitely overcooked. "You always get the things you actually want." There was something underneath that sentence I didn't know what to do with, so I let it pass, the way I let most things about Theo pass, filing them away in the part of my chest where I kept everything I wasn't allowed to examine too closely. Because here was the truth I'd never said to anyone, not even after 3 beers on a bad night with my only friend who knew. I had been in love with my roommate for 2 of the 3 years we'd lived together, and I had built my entire life around not letting it show. I dated other people, briefly, unremarkably. I took the extra shifts that kept me out of the apartment on nights he had Elena over. I had become an expert in loving someone from exactly one careful, invisible step away. "Kai." He said my name like he was testing whether it still worked. "Can I ask you something weird?" Depends how weird. Do you ever feel like you've been performing your whole life? Like there's a version of you that everyone agreed on a long time ago, and you just keep playing him, because starting over sounds like too much work? I set my fork down. My heart was doing something complicated and inconvenient. Yeah, I said carefully. I feel like that a lot, actually. He nodded slowly, like that answer mattered more than it should have. Then he changed the subject, the way he always did right when we got close to something real, and I let him, because that had always been our agreement, spoken or not. We could stand at the edge together, but neither of us would ever be the one to jump. Elena called me 2 weeks later. I almost didn't answer, but something about her name on my screen felt like a door I wasn't allowed to ignore. I need to ask you something, she said, no hello, no preamble. And I need you to be honest, even if it's uncomfortable. Okay. Is Theo in love with you? The question landed in my chest like a dropped glass. I stood very still in the stairwell of my office building, phone pressed hard against my ear, and for a moment I couldn't find a single word. That's not, I started. We're just roommates, Elena. Friends. I didn't ask what you two call it, she said gently now. I asked what it is. Because for 2 years I dated a man who was kind to me and honest with me and never once looked at me the way he looked at his phone every time your name showed up on it. I'm not angry. I promise I'm not angry. I just need to stop wondering if I imagined it. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Because answering would have meant admitting something I'd spent 3 years building an entire life around not admitting. You don't have to say anything, she said. I just thought you deserved to know what I saw, since apparently neither of you were ever going to tell each other. After we hung up, I stood in that stairwell for a long time, replaying every small moment I'd catalogued and dismissed over 3 years, every excuse he made to sit closer than he needed to, every time he'd found a reason to touch my shoulder and then pulled back too fast, every night he'd stayed up late just because he wasn't tired, sitting in the dark with me instead of going to bed. I had built a whole architecture of self-protection around the idea that none of it meant what I wanted it to mean. Elena had just handed me a set of blueprints that said otherwise, and I didn't know if I had the courage to walk into that building. I didn't tell Theo about the call. I told myself it wasn't my secret to hand him, it was his to find, if he ever chose to look. But something shifted in me after that conversation, some careful wall I'd spent years reinforcing developed a crack. And cracks, I was learning, have a way of spreading whether you want them to or not. The Chicago studio called with an offer 2 days later. A real one, relocation package, a start date, a life in a different city with my name on a business card and no landlord to share a kitchen with. It was everything I'd told myself I wanted since the day I first felt something for Theo Marsh that scared me more than any client deadline ever could. I told him over dinner, watching his face instead of my plate. He set his fork down very carefully, like the table might tip if he moved too fast. When? 6 weeks. If I take it. If. I haven't decided. What's there to decide? His voice had an edge in it I didn't recognize. It's Chicago. It's the job you've wanted since I've known you. There's a lot to decide, actually. I hadn't meant to say it like that, sharp, half a confession dressed up as an argument. He looked up at me and for one long moment neither of us said anything, the air between us thick with everything we'd spent 3 years agreeing not to say out loud. Don't take it, he said finally, quiet enough that I almost missed it. Theo. I know that's not fair of me. I know I don't get to ask you to give up your career because He stopped himself, jaw tight, eyes somewhere over my shoulder instead of on my face. Because the apartment would be quiet. That's all I meant. It would be quiet. It wasn't all he meant. We both knew it wasn't all he meant. But he'd built the same wall I had, brick for brick, and neither of us was ready to be the one who tore it down first. I haven't decided, I said again, softer this time, and let him have the lie a little longer, because some truths need to be approached slowly or not at all. The night everything cracked open started with rain, the kind that turns a city into a smear of taillights and neon, the kind that makes staying in feel less like a choice and more like the only sane option. Theo came home soaked through, having walked instead of taking the bus, and stood dripping in our doorway with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Something unguarded. Something frightened. I told my mother about Elena today, he said, before I'd even asked. She wanted to know what happened. I told her the truth, that Elena said I wasn't really there. That some part of me belonged to someone else. I went very still. What did your mom say? She asked. Who? His voice cracked slightly on the word. And I couldn't answer her, Kai, because I've spent so long telling myself it wasn't true that I don't even know how to say it out loud anymore. But she knew. I think she's known longer than I have. I set down the mug I'd been holding, my hands unsteady in a way that embarrassed me. Theo. I've been so scared, he said, and it came out fast now, like a dam breaking, of what it means. Of what my family would say. Of losing the version of myself everyone already agreed on, the one you asked me about that night, remember? I told you I felt like I was performing. I wasn't being poetic. I meant it. I've been performing a whole life so I wouldn't have to admit what was underneath it. And what's underneath it? My voice barely made it out of my chest. He looked at me then, rain still dripping from his hair onto our second-hand carpet, and for the first time in 3 years he didn't look away. You, he said. It's always been you. Since the first month you moved in and I made a fool of myself trying not to stare every time you laughed at something stupid I said. I told myself it was easier to love someone quietly than to risk losing you by loving you loud. I let Elena believe I was choosing her because it was safer than admitting who I actually wanted. The room went perfectly silent except for the rain against the window. I thought of every excuse I'd built, every reason I'd told myself none of this was real. I thought of Chicago, of the careful, invisible step I'd kept between us for 3 years. I got the offer, I said quietly. I was going to take it. I was going to leave and never tell you why I really needed to. Then don't. His voice broke completely on the second word. Please, Kai. Don't leave. Not because of the apartment. Because I don't know how to be the person I actually am anywhere you're not standing next to me. We didn't kiss that night. I want to be honest about that, because the moment felt too enormous for something so simple, and both of us knew it. Instead we sat on that ugly second-hand couch until 3 in the morning, talking in a way we'd never let ourselves talk before, about the years we'd wasted circling each other, about Elena, about his mother's silence on the phone that he still didn't know how to interpret, about my own family, who hadn't spoken to me in 4 years after I told them who I was, and how that silence had taught me to love carefully, from a safe distance. So it could never happen to me twice. I'm not scared of loving you, I told him, somewhere near 2 in the morning, when the rain had softened into something quieter. I'm scared of what it costs the people who do. I can't promise you it won't cost anything, Theo said. I can't promise my mother will come around, or that this will be easy, or that I won't mess it up sometimes because I'm still learning how to stop performing. But I can promise I'm done pretending I don't want this. I'm done watching you almost leave for a whole city just so I wouldn't have to be brave. That's a big word. Brave. It's the only word I've got left. I ran out of the safe ones. I reached across the space between us, that careful, invisible step I'd guarded for 3 years, and closed it. His hand found mine like it had been waiting the entire time, and neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. Some truths, once spoken, don't require an encore. It wasn't easy after that. I want to be honest about that too, because love stories that pretend the hard part ends the moment 2 people admit how they feel are lying to you. Theo's mother didn't call for 3 weeks. When she finally did, it was a short conversation, careful and stilted, more silence than words, but she didn't hang up, and Theo told me afterward that for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. Not everything. Enough. I turned down Chicago. It wasn't a sacrifice, not really. A Studio 2 neighborhoods over offered me freelance work that let me build the career I wanted without leaving the city, without leaving him, and I told myself that counted as getting everything rather than giving something up. Some days I believed it more than others. We told our friends slowly, carefully, the way you introduce a fragile thing to weather it hasn't faced yet. Some of them already knew, or suspected, the way Elena had. Some were surprised. All of them, eventually, seemed to understand that we hadn't fallen in love overnight. We had simply stopped hiding what had been true for years. There were harder nights too. A night Theo panicked over a work event where he'd have to introduce me, unsure of the words, unsure of himself, and I held his hand under the table until he found his footing. A night I woke from a nightmare about my parents' silence, and he didn't try to fix it, just stayed awake with me until the sun came up, the same way I'd once stayed awake with him. Love, it turned out, wasn't the dramatic confession in the rain. That was just the door. Love was everything after, the ordinary, unglamorous work of choosing each other on the days it would have been easier not to. A year later, we moved out of the apartment above the laundromat. Not because anything was wrong, because Theo had finally finished the architecture project he'd been quietly working on for months without telling me what it was for, and it turned out to be the floor plan of a small house upstate, the kind with a porch and too many windows and a garden neither of us knew how to keep alive. "I know it's not Chicago," he said the day he finally showed me the drawings, a little sheepish, like he was afraid I'd think it was too much, too fast, too permanent. "I know we haven't talked about anything like this." I looked at the plans for a long time, at the second bedroom he'd labeled, in his careful architect's handwriting, studio, for Kai. At the porch he'd drawn facing east, so the morning light would hit it first. "You built the whole house before you asked me if I wanted one," I said. "I didn't build anything yet. I just drew it." He looked nervous in a way I still wasn't used to seeing on him. I wanted to know if it was something worth building before I let myself want it too much. I thought about the first night he came home heartbroken, standing in our hallway with his tie loosened, looking at me like I was the only solid thing left in the room. I thought about every year I'd spent loving him from one careful step away, certain that keeping my distance was the only way to keep from losing him. "Build it," I told him. "Build all of it. I'm not going anywhere." He smiled, the real one, the one I'd spent 3 years learning to recognize underneath all his careful, guarded ones, and for the first time since I'd known him, Theo Marsh didn't look like he was performing anything at all. He just looked like a man who'd finally stopped running from the truth of who he was, standing in a kitchen with the person he'd been afraid to want, no longer afraid of anything at all. Some nights, when it's quiet and the porch light is on and the garden is doing slightly better than it was last spring, I think about how close I came to boarding a plane to Chicago and never finding out what would have happened if I'd stayed. I think about how he came home heartbroken one ordinary rainy night, and how I almost let that be just another quiet thing I chose not to notice. I'm glad I noticed. I'm glad I stayed. Some love stories start with fireworks. Ours started with a slammed door, a silent hallway, and a man who finally, after everything, asked me not to leave.